My younger brother, Ben, is the co-founder and executive director of Broadway for Arts Education. It's an organization which believes in the power of an arts education to empower and uplift and inspire young people and to improve the quality of life in the communities in which they live. At some point today, he'll be landing back in the country after a month in India, visiting with his organization's flagship partner, Shanti Bhavan, a school founded with the intention of serving children from families stuck in the societal and economic rut carved out by generations of being classified as members of the Dalit or untouchable caste. For the last 7 years, Broadway for Arts Ed has been helping to send music ambassadors to Shanti Bhavan to teach music classes, direct choirs, and offer private lessons to students there. They've also expanded programming to other international programs, as well as arts projects in 5 Title I schools in New York City. One of the mantras that they teach to the students they serve, the teachers who work with them, and members of the board, even the donors that they work with, is this: live in the orange. What does this mean? Picture a stoplight, red, orange, and green, but the lights represent your psycho-emotional well-being, right? Green kind of represents a state of comfort, a state in which you are not being challenged physically or mentally or emotionally or spiritually. Green is safe, restful, peaceful, but it's also stagnant. Now, on the opposite end is red, which represents burnout, essentially, a state of being overwhelmed and overcome by stress, anxiety, fear, panic, doubt. Red is unsafe, and it's also stagnant, but the stagnancy of being paralyzed by fear and completely shutting down, of pushing yourself too hard. So orange then represents this state in which we can grow. It's being challenged to move and think in new ways, the state of problem solving. Living in the orange requires that we trust ourselves and that we trust others. It is a welcome of some discomfort into our lives, acknowledging it as necessary for our growth. Now, this philosophy suggests that living in the green, while comfortable, is ultimately selfish. If my baseline is comfort, then it's quite tempting for me to stay there and to overlook the reality that very few people on this planet can claim the same baseline. For me to stay in the green ultimately requires me to overlook or ignore the suffering and discomfort of many others, because acknowledging someone else's struggles will impede my own personal comfort. Living in the green is only sustainable so long as I am willing to overlook the fact that my comfort is at the expense of countless others. Living in the red is unsustainable, perhaps fueled by hypersensitivity to the suffering of others, or simply the sense of how impossible it is for me to do something about everything. As I touched on last week, that fear that effective ministry must be big and impressive and all-encompassing, right? It's not good enough to do something. We have to do everything. And now, red is the color of panic. Now, living in the orange requires faith, believing in oneself, trusting my capacity to do good while also acknowledging its limitations. Right? We push into the red when we shame ourselves or others for those limitations. And we fall back into the green when we expect too little of ourselves or others. The book of Deuteronomy is a book of law, extensive and thorough. It is in Deuteronomy that we find nearly all of the 613 commandments of the Torah, which Jews were expected to uphold. Without even beginning to list the expectations and stipulations of each law, simply the number 613 begins to push us into the red, doesn't it? I mean, how overwhelming. How are we possibly supposed to remember and respect 613 different laws every day? With every breath we take, every thought we think, every move we make, every word we speak. Then comes chapter 30, verse 11. What I'm asking of you is not too hard for you. It's a statement of God's faith in God's people. And if you think about it, it's kind of an invitation to live in the orange. God's way of telling us that we can do it. Don't give up. God will make you prosperous in all your undertakings and the fruits of your bodies, your livestock, your gardens. Just obey these commandments. Each rabbi had their own way of interpreting and living out the Torah. This was known as that rabbi's yoke. If a rabbi invited you to be their disciple, to learn from them, then you were also expected to take on their yoke, their particular way of living out the law of God. As verse 9 suggests, the validity of a yoke is problematically demonstrated in the prosperity of its adherents. Now, I say problematically because, as we see in the early temptations of Jesus before he began his public ministry, prosperity is also an indicator of having been blessed for pledging fealty to Satan. We see Jesus time and again challenging Pharisees whose yokes allow them to live in the green, while those they are leading are drowning in red. To those whose love for God has become hindered by adherence to the law, Jesus' invitation to live in the orange is an invitation to new life. As he puts it, to take my yoke upon you, for it is easy. My burden is light. He is inviting them to live as he lives, to trust the capacity for life and love that he sees in them. Now, to those who were living in the red, this invitation comes as relief, freedom, permission to set personal boundaries. But to those who were living in the green, who were prospering at others' expense, this invitation comes as a threat to their comfort, a challenge to the status quo, an unwelcome discomfort. When Jesus was asked to summarize his yoke by a young lawyer, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus turns the question back on him, asking him, "What does the Torah say?" "Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul," he says, quoting from Deuteronomy 6. "And love your neighbor as yourself," he adds from Leviticus 19. Boom, you got it, Jesus says, or at least that's what I like to imagine him saying. Do this, and you will live. Now here, as elsewhere in other Gospels, Jesus summarizes all the law and the prophets into the command to do what is loving. Famously, however, this young lawyer is unsatisfied with this summary. And he must know exactly where the lines are drawn. Who is my neighbor? And in Jesus' response, he tells a story which can be summarized thusly. Once there was a man who was literally in the red, losing blood and dying. And there were some people who were walking along in the green and made very good and seemingly righteous justifications to stay there. Then along came a guy who was willing to save this man's life by stepping into the orange. So where does God want you to live? Jesus then asks the lawyer, who mumbles under his breath, "In the orange." "Yes," Jesus tells him, "go live in the orange."